For Chapter 6, we're going to list specific reforms that Roosevelt obtained in 1935 and 1936, including the Social Security Act, SSA, the Works Progress Administration, WPA, the National Youth Administration, NYA, and the Wagner Act. The Social Security Act was signed into law by Roosevelt in August of 1935. The Social Security Act contained 2 social insurance programs, 3 relief programs, and other smaller programs. The social insurance programs, primarily the unemployment insurance and old age pensions, were attractive to Roosevelt because they were self-funding. The benefits were financed from payroll taxes levied on employers and employees. He knew that insurances were more politically acceptable to Americans because it represented something that they earned themselves as opposed to viewing it as a government handout, which is what some of the people considered welfare to be at that time. Roosevelt decided to replace the Federal Emergency Relief Administration with federal relief programs that catered to only 3 groups of persons in need: elderly persons, which was called Old Age Assistance or OAA, children and families with 1 caretaker, called Aid to Dependent Children or ADC, and blind persons, which was called Aid to the Blind or AB. All other destitute persons, including single, non-elderly persons and families with 2 parents, were returned to local or general assistance welfare programs, which were entirely funded by state and local resources. Many of these poor relief agencies were punitive in orientation and racist in their practices. Between 1935 and 1940, $14 billion was allocated to the Works Progress Administration Program, WPA. The Works Progress Administration provided work relief to 7.8 million people. However, it was criticized by conservatives that it enticed people to become dependent on public jobs rather than seek employment in the private sector. Although it was never funded at levels that would allow it to help more than 2/3 of the eligible people, it ultimately gave hope to millions of Americans who were unemployed. The National Youth Administration, NYA, was established within the Works Progress Administration, WPA, at the insistence of Eleanor Roosevelt. The NYA established a broad range of programs: college aid for impoverished students, aid for high school students, public jobs and recreation centers and municipal services, camps for rural youth to provide trade skills. In 1936 and 1937, 600,000 youths, many who were in extreme poverty, were aided by NYA, even though the wages of NYA workers were only 1/3 of the prevailing wages. The Wagner Act was enacted in 1935. Senator Wagner proposed legislation that more clearly defined specific procedures to be followed when employees wanted to initiate a union. He also proposed establishment of an independent board to enforce rights of union organizers. Ultimately, unions became pillars of the Democratic Party from 1936 all the way up to the 1970s, providing the bulk of campaign finances and voters. As we near the end of the presentation, you may be thinking, why does any of this matter? Well, although WPA and NYA were terminated by 1943 due to World War II, the New Deal proved the ability of the federal government to develop and oversee major social programs. The New Deal may have had its faults, but it was not corrupt. It used public resources efficiently and developed an array of enlightened policies, markedly the Social Security Act. The New Deal also demonstrated that the American welfare state can and should help citizens find employment.